Thank you. So we are Jim White, Jean Turney, and Turner, and oh, I'm sorry about that, Jean. I couldn't have. Let me start all over. Jim White, Jean Turner, and Stacy Levy, and myself, Aviva Romani. And I believe we're all in different states. Jean is in Louisiana, Jim is in Colorado, and Stacy, where are you right now?
I'm in the hinterlands of Pennsylvania,
All
right in the
right.
middle of the state.
And I'm in New York, and it is election day. And I thought it might be a good time to talk about what happens when systems change, because it's likely that regardless of the outcome of this election, some systems are going to continue to change, and they have been changing. So I thought a good place to start might be with physics. And Jim, can you give us all a brief summary from the point of view of physics of what happens when a system changes?
What happens when a system changes?
Yes.
What are you, what are you looking for?
Thermodynamically, what happens when we go from one state to another state?
Well, physics tells us that there are many properties that have to be conserved. So when you go from one state to another state, it takes energy to do so, typically, unless it happens to be a endothermic transition. There's usually, like I said, there's usually a price to pay, and eventually the system will change back, or something will happen to it. Is that what you're fishing for, or do you
what
want?
What happens when a system changes back? Why does it change back?
It typically changes back because the state it was in is the more stable state, the less energetic state. The universe is constantly trying to fall apart into chaos, which makes a hell of a lot of sense to me in my world. I don't know about you guys, but that's what it's trying to do. And that's the lowest energy state. So that's where it would like to go. It takes work to organize. It takes work to put it into a much more coherent state.
Okay, now let's go to Jean. And Jean, can you describe dynamically what has happened to the Gulf of Mexico as it has changed from one regime to another, specifically since the BP spill?
So let's see, to try to follow on Jim's basins of attraction.
And Jean, speak into the mic a bit more, please.
I wonder why it's not picking me up.
It's picking you up, but low.
And so forth. So the basin of attraction requires some energy to get over the catalytic hump or to go into a new basin of attraction. And the BP spill was a reaction that brought us up to the lip of that kind of catalytic hill before it went into another one. But then afterwards, it immediately kind of reassembled back into the previous basin. So we had an oil spill, for example. We had an oil spill. There were some safety rules to help prevent the next one. And as soon as Trump got in, they reneged on those safety rules. And the guy that in fact announced it was the Department of Natural Resource, former head of the Department of Natural Resources for Louisiana. And they basically said, do it again. The rules got stiffer and then they relaxed. So they didn't quite make it over to the catalytic hump. And the same thing happened with Valdez spill 20 years earlier, they had some things that were then becoming standard practice. For example, they had double hold ships instead of single hold. That did that rule was maintained, but they had other ones in which they relaxed again. So they had an immediate flurry of, oh no, this couldn't happen, this should never happen again, and they changed some rules, so they had things put into place to stop that, and then some things they backed away from them, both in Valdez and Louisiana. I think for a while, the one thing that did change is that they had a slew of research money that has lasted. It's going to last for another year now. We've been recipients of it. And that is pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, it gave us a free hand to do pretty much what we wanted. So that's good. Now, whether people follow the policy implications from that is another question. So that's a long answer to your.
For our audience, can you please explain what a catalytic hill is?
So if you have a position, you might think of it as a small basin. It's the rim of you have to cross over on the outside in order to go up and then come down into another basin of attraction. There's these positions that Jim said that systems kind of like to stay in, and to change another, slavery would be one. Other social things, very small scale things, just moving. There's just habits is for one, but more grossly behavioral patterns. And it takes a lot to push them out from one set of position, from one to another. That intermediate point between the former and the new is the catalytic hump that you have to pass through. And you don't often pass through because that's why it's a catalytic hump. You have to have a trigger point, as some people on this group would say.
So, Stacy, in the Echo Dialogue, which at least 3 of us are part of, we've recently been discussing some points from one of our artists, Guillermo, about what kinds of methodologies lead to environmental change through ecological art. And I don't know if you've had a chance to follow some of that discussion, but I wonder what thoughts you have about how art instigates a change in systems from your own experience.
The whole idea of art and change is really interesting. I'm leaning over to talking to my phone here, because originally artists weren't really, it wasn't anticipated that art had anything to do with change except perhaps a change of heart. And I think that now artists are taking on the fact that change in the world is a possible outcome of our work is entirely new and very exciting and not fully worked out, which is why these dialogues are incredibly important to have. But it hasn't really been the role of the artist to be an agent of change, except to be an agent of creating something new. Like newness was very important and uniqueness was essential. But the idea that we could, as a profession, could facilitate a change in people's behavior is something, it's something quite new to this kind of art, I think. And so how we've been handling that change and whether we're truly effective at it, we're so new to it that it is going to take some time before we can really look and judge whether this is an effective methodology.
And Daisy, can you just check why it is that Stacy's not coming up full screen?
Oh, I see myself here.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think it's because she's using her telephone.
Oh,
Right, I'm
That's
talking
right.
into my phone. I could hang up, but I don't know if I
All
feel
right,
like I
so
know.
your phone miniaturized you.
Well, because,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Out of a few times
Yeah,
on
you-
minute drive.
Stacey, you
Well,
look like
you
a
saw
giant
my-
green phone.
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No, she just looks like a giant green phone.
Oh,
So I don't know if you saw, Jean or Stacy saw my responses to Tim Collins, who argued that art does not change anything. But basically what I said was that historically, societies have always assumed that art changes things. That's certainly the case in indigenous societies. And it had been the case up until about the end of the 18th century, I would argue. And that's a really interesting date to me because I've been studying music theory to apply to my own work. And what is so interesting about the evolution of music theory is that it's all about reconciling different kinds of voices. It's all about what creates a dissonant voice and what creates a harmonious voice, and then the exact way that you resolve those dissonances. So that's something that was specific to the Baroque area, the full flowering of that. And what's interesting about that is that it comes out of the Age of Reason, when people thought that logic could resolve all problems. And just before the spate of revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, which basically said, well, no, sometimes reason does not solve everything without violence. So I'm very curious to study the structure of those musical ideas because they persist. They persist in all kinds of popular music and all kinds of jazz, that there is this idea that originates in music that conflicting ideas can be resolved. So in my own practice, to answer my own question about where I see change occurring, I have this faith that it's possible to analyze systems and look for the point where an artist can intervene and affect change, be an agent for change that's outside of people's subjective heads. My theory is that in the 18th century, they decided that they didn't want artists meddling in change whatsoever. So they relegated us all to producing products for entertainment of the status quo. And we have stayed there for at least a couple hundred years. And maybe we're throwing off that particular yoke.
There was a non-artist on this group. It seems that art is more than painting. It's also poetry and writing and buildings, how you design buildings, and that it doesn't really make any difference if you're trying to change or maintain behaviors that you've been doing it really for a long time.
Wait a minute, we're getting some feedback.
Oh, something here. I'm gonna. Oh, something here. Did that improve
Yes.
things? Oh,
Yes.
let me see.
I think it's
Better.
because you have your phone and your computer. Maybe you tried to
Okay.
put your computer on.
There. Yeah, I think we're good now.
Good.
Little
That's
feedback there.
copacetic. Very good.
Okay. Good. Sorry for the feedback.
Please go ahead, Jean.
All right. So I was thinking that as you were talking, Stacy and Aviva, that art in a general sense has been playing a role in behavior, maybe not to change things, but sometimes just to keep it status quo. There's Greek theater, there's Michelangelo, there's all kinds of forms of art which has been used for maintaining bureaucratic structures, as well as try to incite change, like I don't know, Zola or other people. They're trying to bring change, or whether or not they succeed, the point was to try to affect behavior. And from that point of view, art hasn't changed at all, and from the point of just trying to be part of a social sphere of influence. I mean, and it's done admirably at both of those at times. It's regrettably maintained bureaucracies that didn't deserve to be maintained, and other times tore them down, or at least, helped with it.
Well, there was a very famous she's still alive, art critic and art historian, Rosalind Deutsch, who maintained in the 60s that all public art is for the purpose of sustaining the status quo. And public art is not approved unless it will continue the status quo. So I have a question for our scientists, which is, to what extent is the role of science or the role of a scientist changing today insofar as you're moving from essentially passively collecting and analyzing information to having an impact? I realize that that is exactly what the struggle is these days with science, that some politicians don't want science to have an impact. But I also know that increasingly scientists have been really frustrated with that helplessness. So would either one of you like to comment on that?
Well, I don't think the role of science and scientists has changed in its fundamental sense. I mean, we're still the ones who are supposed to be out there trying to understand whatever it is we're studying and determine as best we can what is the truth, and that's our goal. What has changed, I think, tremendously over the last decade or so is the communication of that information, and the reality that a false narrative can be put out there and ways found to support it, in essence making the truth less relevant. And that is, strikes at the heart of academia. I think it certainly strikes at the heart of science. So I guess I don't think it's necessarily that the role of science has changed. I think it's the role of how we communicate and how we incorporate science into our decision-making process. If politicians are willing to take what is blatantly not true and use it to justify their actions, then this is, that's not a scientific problem. It's a political problem and a communication problem. But it's become clear to me that you can sell the biggest line of bullshit, and you can sell it really effectively, and people will buy it, and at least for some period of time they'll buy it. So it's that to me is really an interesting change and a way of using social media that I don't know if anybody really saw coming.
Well, on the other hand, you could argue that Galileo sure saw the results of suppressing the truth.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because they're not putting scientists in jail. They're not house arrest. What they're doing is putting out a blatantly false narrative, selling it as the truth, and then pretty much just running over, the scientists. And that's a very different, that seems to me to be a very different thing. It's the Catholic Church was scared of Galileo's message. They wouldn't have imprisoned him, I don't think, had he been insignificant. The fact that art at the time had great significance gave Galileo gave him a lot of power. There is no climate scientist or environmental scientist or any scientist that I know of right now who's being put in jail because of their science. There are some who are being persecuted, absolutely. I have good friends of mine who are being persecuted, but not in the same way that Galileo was.
Your friend with the hockey stick.
Yeah, Mike certainly, has, it's turned his world upside down to some degree.
Do you want to briefly describe what happened with him?
Well, there was a paper, I forgot when it was published. It was a long time ago now. But it was basically just a paper that pulled together a whole bunch of data about temperature observations over the last 1,000 years. And documented that the world was warming up, hence that hockey stick thing.
In
But
his
the authors on that paper, Mike Mann, Ray Bradley, Malcolm Hughes, they got just absolutely beat up, and it was not pleasant at all. All three of them are friends of mine, and Ray has come on a couple of occasions and spoken here at CU about his experiences in that, not just his science, but his experiences in that process. And it was pretty ugly.
Well, wouldn't you say that that's the reaction of people who are just as scared as the Catholic Church was of Galileo telling them that the world was round?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think that Galileo was really punished in a very different way. I think this was, they tried to use the legal system, they tried to use the scientific system to go after Mike and to go after Ray, and really they were not successful. They weren't successful in stopping their funding. They weren't successful in stopping their publications. The universities backed them up. They really had no tangible impact. What they did do, and this is a pretty common strategy, is they can tie you up. They can, the lawyers can request information, and, Ray would talk about this, the number of open records requests that he had to respond to and that Mike had to respond to. That chewed up a lot of time.
It's incredible.
Yeah, a lot of valuable time.
Right.
I've had to do that as well, and it's in a sense, I see it as a price you pay for having an open society. But it's really blatant use of the law to get your result, and I think it's a misuse of the law, to be quite honest.
It is interesting to hear this.
Go ahead,
I was just going to say that that earlier, before this crazy administration, I think if you had an important work you were doing as a scientist, you would probably be able to embark upon that project and perhaps even get funding for it. And I feel like, wow, this is terrible. This is happening to scientists. But I'll tell you, this sounds exactly what it's like to be an artist, where you're it's like we're sharing the same feelings. Your funding is perennially tenuous, and instead of objectivity, you're completely in a world of subjectivity. The people who have the funding or have the power are the ones who decide what gets built, what gets out there. The idea that truth is very subjective. It's like saying taste is very subjective in a certain way. And the fact that great ideas can be squashed by bullies, particularly narrow-minded ones. That has been the environment for artists since forever. We've been working in that sort of hot water for a long time, and it's terrifying to think that science is now in that same boat. But it is interesting to hear how similar it seems for the kind of world we have as artists, and that the idea of like I do a lot of art out in public. And yes, it could be seen as a sort of propaganda by the funders, but you're always trying to work in a slightly subversive way to both get the money and the site and the approvals from the stakeholders, but also to say something true about the place through your artwork. Yeah. And that's a fine line to tread, but that's the job that we now have.
Well, I would argue that it is getting worse for artists. I found the dark money letter I got, and if anybody doesn't know what dark money is, they can read Jane Mayer's book on it. Oops, I have to turn that off. And what the dark money letter did was it said if I continued to work on the Blue Tree Symphony, they would destroy my career and keep me tied up in litigation and on and on and on and on. I think artists are more vulnerable than scientists because we rarely have an institution protecting and backing us.
True.
If we run into hot water, we have the art community, but that's relatively modest to protect us. And I think it's comparable to the kind of outrageous things we've seen Saudi Arabia do with Khashoggi, that whoever reports the truth becomes a target in some very monstrous ways. I hope it doesn't escalate in this country, but I'm not convinced that it won't. Jean, I'd love to hear what you have to say about what you learned in the BP spill and the extent to which you felt that as you brought forth the truth, or tried to bring forth the truth of what had happened, you were opposed.
Well, first, I think you could look at smoking, how smoking was disallowed, what it took to do that. So people would fund a particular point of view. And if scientists need anything, it's going to be money to figure out some of these things. So there was focused money sent to the wrong places. When people don't police their own institutions, you allow by omission to have certain viewpoints look as if they're authentic, when in fact they've been tainted by the source of money and the anticipated conclusion. And so that's the background of all of this. And some places have been better about this, protecting the institution than others. But I think for where I am, I think academics have been lazy about protecting their own institution at times. And I fully agree with your Stacy and Jim's, everybody's point on this. And it just some groups are more vulnerable than others, and they get picked off sooner than others. Certainly, you can see it go with assistant and associate professors, that they have certain things that are demanded of them that aren't demanded of older people. And so gradually the system changes by making them teach more or not, or having different pressures put on them. And so pretty soon, you have to wonder sometimes who gets into the system and says, I can't stand it. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm finding some other way of doing it. And I think we all have that. And that's where you have to make decisions. But, by then you've already spent 9 years getting a degree and so forth. And you got a family and you got to worry about other things. So it's not like everything else these days, it's not free of a lot of pressures on it, especially with money's expected. Universities expect you to find money. And I have enjoyed getting some money because I could just do something. I didn't spend a lot more effort on $20,000 than I did on $100,000, because 20 was where I wanted to spend it. And so that's why we like grants instead of contracts, because grants you can spend it any way you want, in so many words. You don't quite get to do that, but you have a lot more freedom, and people don't really look over your shoulder that much with a grant.
So my question was about the BP spill.
Yeah. So they're not. Former head of NSF is in charge of the whole research money we have, and she understood a lot of these pressures, and so it's really being run as a grant program. And so Rita Caldwell, has let it pretty much run as the investigators think it should be run, to follow the leads and ideas when they come in. It has to be reviewed, and it's been more free of those pressures than other ones. The alternative in this state is to often to go to the state, and they have the narrative, they have expectations of what the results are going to be, which is not harsh and not contradictory. And they have the narrative because they have their own, they have a magazine or two. They aren't going to put anything critical out of themselves. You really have to go walk around them a lot. And it's a lot of the coastal stuff is run by, if I may say so, it's been run by oil and gas interests. So that's what I think of.
Have you ever run up against fossil fuel corporations in the kind of work you do?
I've had them.
I haven't yet. Yeah.
I'm sorry. All right.
Well, you're asking in the art, have I ever run up against fossil?
In your
fuel
own
interests?
art projects?
The most recent thing that happened is a big petroleum factory would not allow me to put my pieces on the riverfront outside of their along their perimeter. And I don't know how this works, but even though they don't own the river, that's owned by the state, they can control what gets permitted out on the surface of the river. And I was creating an art form to show the tides on the lower Schuylkill in Philadelphia. And one of the petroleum factories said absolutely nothing is going along our piece of the river.
Nope.
And so I wasn't able to put anything there, kind of a hole.
Did you ever figure out what the regulatory process was that allowed them to say something like that?
Oh, I was deeply in the midst of that process. It was a Army Corps of Engineer permit, which took 1.5 years to get just to put the art out on the water. And those were the rules of the permit. If a landowner adjacent to the waterway that you're wanting to interact with says no, then you simply don't have permission to do anything. And they wouldn't grant permission. So I just had to skip them, and they're sort of like a missing tooth in the whole project because I couldn't put anything in front of them. They were worried about sort of that I would somehow, by putting, and this is sort of interesting, simply putting art out in the water was a kind of protest in their mind. And I'm not sure why they thought that, but that was as much as I could get from their letter that they sent back to me.
So in what sense did they think it was protest?
I think anything that isn't status quo for a petroleum company is protest. Like anything that might allow people to look more closely at the situation feels to them very threatening. And I would be drawing attention to the shoreline that has all these refinery structures and gas tanks and things. So I think they wanted to just sort of appear as invisible as possible, and the art would have undone their invisibility.
Well, a couple weeks ago, I was in Vermont for a symposium called Feverish, and Bruno Latour was speaking. And he basically said that we now live in two universes, parallel universes. There's the real universe, which includes science, and then there's the fantasy universe, which has been created by Trump. And in that universe, people are going to fly to Mars, and everything is going to be just hunky-dory, and climate change and sea level rise just doesn't matter at all. And to perpetuate that narrative, what he has done, what Trump has done, is to weaponize denial. And so many things as emotional and subjective experiences to wage a war against anybody who disagrees. Jean, you look like you're about to say something.
No, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to get from A to B. That, what are we going to do about all this is a constant. And since this is all driven by the complaints we have are often driven by a top-down pressure, the kind of only thing we have is a bottom-up response. It's very difficult to engage the top to change itself. You have to for example, vote, but I mean, you have to get people to show up or get things said that wouldn't otherwise be said. And that generally means to be somewhat consistent and persistent. You have to keep doing it over and over again. And a lot of times opportunities to do that are not predictable. But I don't know quite how else to it. Occasionally you can find a foundation that will support you, but sometimes you just have to wait.
Well, Jim, you are our resident optimist. What green shoots of hope do you see to change things?
We're voting today.
Yeah.
The best I can do with that is, note that the rules that we play by in science, in the physical world, are fixed and unchanging. There is no subjectivity. I mean, you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and sea level is going to rise. There's not a damn thing you can do about that. So eventually the folks in Florida will catch on, if they're not already. I'm really curious to see how they went in this election, because they're sort of at the front lines of some pretty ugly change. The sad thing is, we've talked about frequently, is that because of inertia in the planet, by the time we realize that things are really bad and we need to do something about it as a collective, they're going to get a whole lot worse. And that's the sad part of this, is you don't live on planet instant gratification. You live on a planet that will absorb abuse and then give it back to you. Even when you reform yourself, you're going to continue to get slammed around. So I started out optimistically and then kind of petered off into some pretty dark shit.
Right. That didn't, that, right. That
interrupted you over
light my
the
day
years.
out.
Sorry, that's just the way.
Interrupted your optimism.
That's just the way it goes.
Stacy, what did you
Well,
say?
I was saying that didn't light up my day, though the sun did just come out. So maybe it did have something. But that kind of, I think, in some ways, learning to live with change is probably going to be the most important thing that we can start to teach people. Like, this is not going to be perfect, and we're not going to bring it back, but we're going to have to basically float on this surface and try to manage. And changes need to be made in not just in how we do things, but also how we think about things. And so that does become another place where art can be very informative to people, to change your sense of what living on Earth is going to be. It's going to be different, and we will be, while we're fighting the good fight, we also have to be thinking about how that existence is going to be quite different than what we're used to. I'm just only a little bit on the front lines on this in terms of dealing with water in the city, where we're going to put all this new water from sustained rain, increased rainstorms, and the increased frequency. Where does it go? We're just going to have to learn to engineer very differently than we've been engineering in the past, because we can't get ahead of the water. We have to live with it. And so that kind of changing how you're going to see yourself in the future is really critical.
Yeah.
I love your remark about top-down pressure makes us have a bottom-up response, and I think bottom-up has been the artist perspective from day one.
So
I think also a lot of different kinds of boundaries are emerging. It's something I noticed during my travels in the past months, that so many groups and so many people are talking about a different set of boundaries. In my own work, between eminent domain law and copyright law. In so many universities now, there are programs to bring artists in and talk interdisciplinarily about problem solving. I think there are many, many areas of the sciences. Jim, you describe yourself as a paleoecologist, but you're about 3 or 4 other things in addition to that. And Jean, you're part of a group that includes artists. And I think that's what happens when systems change. That's the hopeful part, that another system will emerge. The question is, can we adapt to that new system, and will humans be able to survive in it?
So the trick here is that if you look at capitalism, if I may speak freely, and I think so, capitalism is going to have to be overthrown because that's a private enterprise, and we're looking at community well-being. And so it's at the other end of the pole. We have kind of private gain systems on one end, and we have well-being community actions on the other. And so capitalism is not going to give up its territory very easily, but that only is going to go to the other end through the help of, I think, of course, the science is needed, but you have to, because you need to know where limits and so forth are and what's going to happen, but you need to have the value system that humans have to know what choices to make to limit capitalism, or at least to overthrow it. I mean, you can't have this current system continuing. It's going to fall apart one way or the other. And what you want to do is replace it with something that has a more art-centered, human-centered, humanistic value to it. It's not a matter of survival so much to me. It's a matter of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I'd like to go back to you because the tendency in universities for at least the 10 years that I know of has been to do what brings in the money, whether it's in the form of a sports stadium or increased enrollment. And how do you foresee that this is going to balance out so that the principles of truth are reified rather than capitalism?
Well, yeah, universities, education in general is in a difficult place. I mean, we have to keep the lights on, so we have to pay attention to money. But I don't think we've lost our way. I think, you'll still find that at the core of our value system is the adherence to, what the ancient Greeks called a liberal arts education, where, what do people need to know in order to be good citizens? And that is still what we do today. And the skill set may be broader than it was when the Greeks were around, but the basic idea hasn't changed. The basic idea behind education is to make a better citizenry than we had before. There's certainly parts of academia that get torqued by the possibility of big bucks in one way or another. But I can tell you, we have, and Jean can attest to this, I'm sure, we have, many discussions around, are we losing our way? If a big corporation comes in and says, to the University of Louisiana, I'll give you $1 billion if you do this, this, or this. Wow, that's tempting. But if doing this, this, and this fundamentally, damages the value of the university, then it isn't worth it, and we won't do it. I wish I had the
example.
Huh?
Do you have a recent example?
I don't have any recent examples of where universities have. I'm trying to think. Actually, there was a couple of stories in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently where universities turned down large gifts because the conditions attached to the gifts were unacceptable. We certainly turn down smaller gifts all the time when the conditions of the gift are smaller, meaning less than, say, $1 million. But when the conditions of the gift are unacceptable, we say no. We have to. I mean, the value of the university is significantly higher than anything we've ever been offered.
That's good to hear.
That's a good way to look at it. But there are the sort of insidious ones, like oh, we'll give you money if your cafeterias throughout your campuses do not serve Pepsi and only serve
Yep.
Coke. And it's this sort of Trojan horse sneaking in. It seems innocuous enough. And then all of a sudden, you're being pitched other things because you've let in the Greeks.
Well, we actually, we just had this discussion yesterday. You know, if we were to offer really good food to our students, it costs more. It costs us more and it costs them more. I think the example someone was using was really good cheese. On the other hand, you know, because the money's tight, you know, you can offer students the absolute basics. They'll get calories, you know, and they're probably nutritious, but that means that money's freed up to do other things. And so that is, you know, we do make that choice frequently, and you'll see universities that do really well, you know, that have really fancy dining facilities. But I can tell you those dining facilities cost a lot of money, and they're not giving scholarships because of that, you know, to put it in a blunt sense.
There was a whole podcast episode about this that Malcolm Gladwell did about that exact thing.
Yeah.
And it was about a college in Maine having like gourmet dining and how
Yeah.
a lot of underprivileged kids didn't get to go to that school.
Right,
Are you
exactly.
talking about College of the Atlantic?
No, it was either like not, it was like a B, like Bates or Bowdoin, or I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but they had artisanal cheese. They had all kinds of really fancy dining food. And he was saying how that it's unfortunate that that's how it is, that this.
Yeah. Well, we make choices.
Well, there was an interesting, I remember reading a letter from a student, I don't know if it was in the Atlantic, but saying, I'm in your university and I am here learning to think and thinking for you, sort of as a product of your university, and you're giving me terrible food to sustain my brain with. Maybe you should reconsider your investment in me. And I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it. I never saw a student something the university was cultivating as an organism.
Well, it is, you know, it's an example of the needle you're trying to thread here. You're trying to offer students, you know, a really good learning experience because you want them to learn. And you have to be attractive enough to bring the students in because they're not required to go to a university. If they were required to go to a university, if we had, instead of 12 years of education, we had 16 years of education or 14 years of education mandatory, it'd be a different situation.
So
Yeah,
one
that's
way,
true.
if you know about some of these constraints and influences, Harvard, you know, if you outsource, you get pressures to outsource because free market systems can get it for lower. Well, that's true because they pay people lower. They give meager wages. So what Harvard did, as I understand it, is they made a condition of the contract to outsource that you had to pay people a minimum wage, and it had to be at least this much, and it had to have other conditions about, I suppose, healthcare or whatever else. So they could still outsource, but they had to come up with, you know, something to compensate for what otherwise would be a much lower wage and not paying people, you know, and performing making two classes of people, those with mostly getting by and those that might be, you know, equivalent to the people they're serving. I thought that was pretty clever.
Well, we may all make these trade-offs. Right now, I'm working on an opera, and I'm trying to decide, am I going to compose the music? Am I going to hire a composer? If I hire a composer, how much money do I have available? If I do it myself, I save a lot of money, but I may not get the best result. If I hire a young composer, I give somebody a chance and it could be very interesting. If I hire a famous composer, I probably go bankrupt, but I might get a lot more attention for the work, and you never can tell what might happen next. So we make these trade-offs based on money, and it's not always ideal.
Yeah.
So would anybody like to make some last statements about what happens when a system changes as we wait to hear our election results?
Hoping for change.
I heard 3 mumbles.
It's hard to predict the future, and we often don't see it when it's unrolling in front of us. It's you have these sometimes. Well, there's been a lot of effort to try to find indicators of change before they happen, and we don't have much success doing that. You can look at Trump election; that was totally unexpected.
No, it wasn't unexpected. What I didn't expect was his base, the virulence of his base.
Well, may whoever you voted for win.
Well, it was not the person who's in charge right
Don't
now.
say that in my neighborhood.
What did you say, Stacy?
I said, we don't say that in my neighborhood, because I stand next to people in line and I think, wow, we're all human. We all have sort of the same desires of how things are going to work. And I realize that they're at complete a counterintuitiveness to me. And it always surprises me how humanity can be so variable, that I see the world one way, I breathe the same air as the person next to me, and they see the world a completely different way. And I couldn't tell you why that was.
Alternate universes.
Yes, exactly. They do exist.
Jim, do you have any last words for us?
No, other than go out and vote if you haven't already.
I have voted. So thank you all.
Wait, I just want to say one thing is that in some ways, artists are set up for change because we're always in a flux. And I think that we find a lot of thrill and motivation in change. So I think we're poised because we don't have long-term expectations that things will stay the same. We're poised for this new world in a really good way. So at least there's something in our training that works for the future.
Well, it's interesting to think about whether in fact we are trained to be more open to change than other disciplines. I suspect that's true, although I think it's hard to put my finger on why I believe that. I think because what we're trained to do in art school is, in fact, to just observe. But theoretically, that's the same thing that scientists do. Maybe
True, but I think we're also trained to change or to find something new constantly, because there's always the emphasis on the unique, and which can be a burden, but it means that you're not married to a particular idea that you need to carry through for 20 years or have an entire lab behind you that supports that. So it keeps us a little bit more nimble in a certain way. You're expected not to perhaps do the exact same thing. Everything you make might have change within it. And that, I think, is professionally a different way of seeing your future.
I have to think about that, because one of the things that's come up so often in these conversations is the similarities between art and science, rather than differences.
I would just note that, it's in science. I mean, there may be a reigning paradigm, a theory that is currently people accept, but we're constantly trying to tear it down. I mean, we get more kudos for finding new things than we do for reinforcing old things. Put it like that.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So
Well,
we're in the same boat.
In one of the conversations I had recently with I can't remember whether it was a curator or a museum director, I happened to mention that we're doing these Gulf to Gulf sessions, and I said, they're just conversations. And this person said, just conversations? That's interesting. And I guess it is. That it's something that Susie Goblik did for a while. the idea to do something really, really simple. And now we've done it for at least 10 years, maybe more, going on 11. Who knows where that might lead?
If we had the ability to remember that far back, we could actually remember how long we've been doing this. So
Well, it's actually all on Vimeo.
I know. And I'm not going back.
Find it elsewhere.
Binge watch.
Binge watch,
What's
right?
that?
Binge watch 10 years of.
Binge watch. There you go. 10 years of conversations.
Oh, okay. On that note, I got to go.
Okay.
All right. We'll see
Bye.
ya.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right.